Labour are likely to win with a substantial majority. And what we've seen in the MRP we've conducted is that they reach the 326 seats mark even before we consider seats that are too close to call. And that is something that we draw out in the analysis of this poll. We have nearly 120 seats where there's a sort of 0.5% differential in the lead. And actually, that makes this quite a volatile election as well. 120 that are too close to call, but even without that, Labour still have a majority.
Let's talk inflation. Falling to 2%, the UK's official target for the first time in 3 years. Good news for Rishi Sunak because cost of living, or better news for Keir Starmer because it probably means interest rates will be cut when he becomes Prime Minister?
Yeah, very good question. I think in the immediate term, good news for Rishi Sunak insofar as he had the news just before he went on for a grilling this morning in a Question&A on radio with voters. This is also something that he has placed front and centre unambiguously of his campaign and also of his premiership, really. That was the key of his 5 priorities. We've heard about it a number of times over the previous few months. And indeed, the last drop in inflation, which didn't quite reach the target but was very close to it, was credited with being one of those reasons why Rishi Sunak jumped headfirst into that snap election. So clearly it's something that Number 10 watch extremely closely. And this morning, I think Rishi Sunak will use it to say that they are turning the corner on the economy, and Labour will say, actually, the cost of living shows that people are still not feeling better off. And that's what they'll be talking about today.
And it was really striking on all of the media around this morning. Mel Stride, working paper secretary, being asked about inflation. I think every single interviewer said, how can you take credit for this when you didn't take the blame when it went up to 10%?
Yeah, I mean, that has been the classic refrain when these Tory ministers have been interviewed. And I think we've spoken about this before. But if you look across at Europe, some of the leaders that are embattled, like Macron, who's actually done pretty well with inflation, and some of those that are less embattled and have just won stonky majorities, like Orban, where inflation has been spiralling, it's quite clear that voters think about things that aren't just inflation when they make up their mind. And actually, this might not be as significant when it comes to polling day as we think.
Yeah. Let's talk about you've been looking at what the Conservative Party might look like if the polls are right. We'll hear from Ipsos in a moment about their latest MRP, and the sort of the political makeup of the Conservative Party, because that will obviously have an impact on what might happen afterwards.
Yeah, I've done this exercise before on previous YouGov MRPs, those mega seat-by-seat polls, but this is on the most recent of those, and I'm basically trying to answer this question of what sort of broad ideological makeup the Conservative Party will represent after the election in circumstances where, in this case, they would win 140 seats. And the answer to this, on the face of it, is the moderates, those so-called traditional centre-right Tories, hold a key numerical advantage. I think we can say for certain that will be the case. The question that then follows is, how do they use that advantage? And I don't really think when you speak to One Nation Tory MPs that they're feeling that bullish about the prospect of being able to define the leadership election, because to be able to do that, they would need to stop, in their view, a candidate from the right probably getting onto the ballot paper. That's because it then goes to the membership, who people think usually are likely to go for the more right-of-leaning candidate of the two. It would require quite a sophisticated system of vote lending that even some of the senior One Nation Tory MPs or Tory candidates rather, that I spoke to admitted was probably beyond them. But what it does do, in their view, is it allows them probably to temper the kind of more extreme instincts of some of those who are arguing for the party to take a much more right-wing turn after the election. So they're saying we might not be able to get our candidate or chosen candidate to win a Tory leadership election, but what these numbers show is that there will be a clear majority to avoid perhaps some of the more the worst instincts, such as, for example, admitting, in their view, Nigel Farage to the party after the election. That's shaping up to be one of the big essay questions that could define that contest. And in their view, these numbers speak to being able to hold quite a considerable amount of power of that. And I should say on those numbers, it's more than 60 moderates that we found, and then about kind of 34 or 35, I think it is, candidates that are clearly drawn from the party's right. The big unknown, and one of the most interesting things, I think, is what role do those new Tory MPs play, who we won't have seen before in Parliament. I think it will
be slightly harder to place on the
So they're
spectrum.
very hard to place, and there's 31 under this poll, so a fair portion of those 140. And while some of them have made previous remarks about particular Tory candidates, or made particular statements which mean you might think that you can place them in an ideological box, when they arrive, I think they're likely to be pretty impressionable. Often that is what we've seen with new intakes of MPs before, and it's very difficult to say in which direction they will go when they are pressed on choosing a future leader. But clearly that's not an insignificant portion of the party and about their ideology. We just don't really know.
Or just stay there, Lara. Let's bring in Kelly Beaver now, who's the chief executive of Ipsos, the polling company. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Matt.
Now, you've done your own MRP poll, the first MRP big seat-by-seat breakdown of what you think might happen. It's a bit different to other people. First of all, give us the headline figures, and we'll talk about how you went about doing it.
Okay, so we've estimated that Labour could win around just over 450 seats, the Conservatives on 115. So that would give a Labour a majority of 256 specifically. And then below the surface of that, if you look at what the implied vote share is by each party based on the MRP, it's sort of Labour on 43, Conservatives 25%, Reform UK on 12. We have them projected to win 3 seats, Lib Dems on 10%, similar 3 seats, Greens on 6%, SNP 3%, Plaid Cymru 1, and then others 1.
And tell us about your method for doing this and how you found the people to take part in it.
Yes, so this is the first of the MRP models which has used a random probability method. So that just means that our participants, so first of all, Matt, the sample that you utilise to derive your estimates is a real key input. So the quality of the sample is important. Participants for this panel have been recruited via a random, unclustered, address-based sampling approach. So this is basically, instead of people saying they want to participate in an online panel, we're physically reaching out to people in a randomised way. So households across the UK have an equal chance of being asked to participate. They're invited via letter. So we send letters out to households, and it's considered the gold standard methodology for online data collection in the country.
Because what you're not doing is catching people who are very online,
or
people who are at home during the day. Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of completely
The other key differential, just if I may, is that online panels normally just look at people who are online. What we've done with this methodology is also allow people who are offline to be able to participate by giving them access to a tablet, which is locked down specifically just to be able to complete studies and surveys. So we don't change their behaviour by bringing them online. They're still offline, but they have the ability to participate as well. So that's 4% of the UK population who are often missed out in some of the online polls too.
And I suppose, given, like you said, it's an estimate, and once you start getting down to seat by seat, it's difficult. What this tells us, to some extent, is whichever way you recruit your people, looking at all the polls, the Tories seem to be at real risk of ending up with fewer MPs than they did in 1997. That's the sort of, and whether it's 100 or 115 or 120 or 70, it's looking very bad.
So that's right. And at this midway point through the campaign, Labour are likely to win with a substantial majority. And what we've seen in the MRP we've conducted is that they reach the 326 seats mark even before we consider seats that are too close to call. And that is something that we draw out in the analysis of this poll. We have nearly 120 seats where there's a sort of 0.5% differential in the lead. And actually, that makes this quite a volatile election as well. 120 that are too close to call, but even without that, Labour still have a majority.
Really interesting. Thanks so much for that, Kelly. Kelly Beaver there from Ipsos. And Lara, we've got another YouGov MRP poll coming today. Within the margins of error or the parameters of the different ways they're calculating it, they're all essentially telling us there's going to be a big Labour majority. Yeah,
exactly. And this is the penultimate poll, major poll from YouGov that we'll see coming out at 5 p.m. tonight. The last, of course, saw, I think, about a dozen cabinet ministers forecast to lose their seats, those so-called Portillo moments. People will be looking closely at that. But I think you're right to say that at this point, these polls are saying, the headline is relatively similar.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Lara. Lara Spirit there, Times Red Box editor.